In the frozen wilderness of Wyoming Territory, Sheriff Luke Carver made a choice that would change everything. When he found a battered Apache woman dying in the snow, he could have ridden past. Instead, he carried her to his cabin, not knowing she was the daughter of a powerful chief or that his old colonel would stop at nothing to reclaim his prize. This is a story about sanctuary sacrifice and the family we choose when the world turns against us. If you love stories of unlikely heroes and second chances, you're going to love this one. Hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible Western tales. She's the chief's daughter, but I'll die protecting her. Betun, sheriff saves Apache woman, changes everything. The cold bit deeper this far north of Clearwater, the kind that made a man's bones ache and his breath freeze in his chest. Sheriff Luke Carver pulled his coat tighter as his horse picked its way through the drifts, the snow crunching under hooves with sounds sharp as gunshots in the stillness. This patrol took him farther from town than most folks thought wise, but Luke needed the distance, needed the silence that came with empty trails and endless white. At 34, he'd worn the badge for 6 years, ever since he'd hung up his Army blues and tried to find something resembling peace in civilian life. Peace. The word tasted bitter as day-old coffee. He reined in his horse at the crest of Widow's Ridge, scanning the valley below. Nothing moved except wind-blown snow and the occasional rabbit track disappearing into the underbrush. Perfect. Another hour of this patrol and he could head back to his cabin where silence lived comfortable as an old friend. The figure against the pine caught his eye because it didn't belong. Dark against the white, too still to be an animal, too curved to be deadfall. Luke's hand found his Colt, automatically old reflexes dying hard. He approached slow and careful, every sense alert. Raiders still moved through these parts, and lone travelers sometimes carried more trouble than they were worth. But as he drew closer, his chest tightened with recognition of what he was seeing. A woman. Apache from the look of her clothes and the black hair spilled across the snow like ink. She lay curled against the tree's base, her body already stiff with cold skin, taking on the waxy pallor that came before death claimed its due. Luke dismounted his boots, sinking deep into the drift. He crouched beside her, pulling off his glove to press fingers against her neck. The pulse fluttered weak as a butterfly wing, but it was there, barely. Her face was a map of violent split lip, darkening bruise across her cheek, dried blood at her temple. The deerskin dress was torn in places, revealing skin marked with older injuries. Someone had used her hard before leaving her to freeze. The smart thing would be to ride away. Apache in these parts meant trouble, especially for a lawman. The town council had made their feelings clear about Indian problems, solved them quiet and permanent, no questions asked. But looking at her, Luke didn't see a problem. He saw a dying woman who deserved better than freezing alone in the wilderness. He scooped her into his arms, surprised by how little she weighed. Her head lolled against his chest, lips moving in some language he didn't recognize. Delirious, maybe. Or praying to whatever gods listened to the forgotten. The ride back to his cabin stretched longer than usual, the woman's breathing so shallow he had to keep checking to make sure she was still alive. By the time smoke from his chimney came into view, full dark had settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket. Inside his cabin was sparse but warm. One room with a stone fireplace, a bed in the corner, table and chairs he'd built himself. Home to a man who'd learned not to need much from the world. He laid her on his bed, the only bed, and lit the oil lamp to get a better look. In the golden light, her features were sharp and proud, high cheekbones, straight nose, full mouth, that might have been beautiful before someone's fist split it. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 25, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work. The injuries were worse than he'd hoped. Bruises colored her ribs purple-black, and when he pushed her hair back from her forehead, he saw the burn scar at her temple. Old wound deliberately inflicted. Luke moved to the stove, his hands steadier than he felt. Hot broth first, then whatever doctoring he could manage. He'd learned field medicine in the Army enough to patch bullet holes and set bones. This was different, though. This felt personal in a way that made his chest tight. She stirred as he sat down beside the bed, her eyes fluttering open. Dark eyes sharp with intelligence, even clouded with pain. They fixed on his face, and he saw fear flash through them, quick as lightning. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "You're safe." She studied him for a long moment, those dark eyes taking in his face, his badge, the Colt at his hip. Then she spoke, her voice rough as gravel. "Why The question hung between them, simple and complicated all at once. Because leaving you out there wasn't right, Luke said. She closed her eyes, her breathing shallow, but more even than before. When she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression. Niele, she said. Just the one word, but he understood. Luke Carver, Sheriff of Clearwater. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Sheriff who saves Apache women. Your people will not like this. Luke poured broth into a tin cup, testing it against his wrist. My people will mind their own business. She tried to sit up, winced, and let him help her. The broth went down slow, her hands shaking around the cup. Color began to return to her face, and Luke found himself studying the way lamplight caught in her hair. There is a boy, she said suddenly. Luke's attention sharpened. What boy? Samuel. She struggled for words in English. He is with the horses, in the old barn by Miller's Creek. Luke knew the place abandoned homestead about 2 miles east. If there was a kid out there in this cold. I'll get him, he said, already reaching for his coat. Niele's hand caught his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. He is afraid of white men. His mother was Apache, his father. She shook her head. He will run if you try to take him. Then you'll have to come with me. She studied his face again, that measured look he was beginning to recognize. You would trust me not to run? Luke considered the question seriously. Where would you go in this snow besides? He met her eyes. Running's not what you want to do. Something passed between them, then understanding without words. She nodded once sharp. We go now. Samuel has been alone too long. The barn was exactly where she'd said it would be, half-collapsed roof letting in snow that had drifted knee-deep inside. Luke followed Niele through the gap in the wall, his hand loose near his gun, but ready. The boy was huddled in the far corner, wrapped in a thin blanket, 11 or 12 years old, with the sharp features of mixed blood. His eyes were huge in his thin face as he watched Luke approach. Samuel, Niele called softly in Apache, then switched to English. This is Luke. He is friend. The word seemed to surprise her as much as it did Luke. Samuel's eyes darted between them, wild as a trapped animal. Luke crouched down slowly, keeping his hands visible. Hungry, he asked simply. The boy's stomach answered for him, growling loud in the silence. Luke reached into his coat, pulled out a piece of jerky, and held it out. After a moment's hesitation, Samuel snatched it and tore into it like he hadn't eaten in days, which Luke realized he probably hadn't. Come on, son, Mo, Luke said, standing slowly. Let's get you somewhere warm. Back at the cabin, Luke watched Niele tend to Samuel with gentle efficiency, speaking to him in low Apache, while she checked him for injuries. The boy was thin cold, but basically sound. More importantly, he trusted her completely. His mother was killed 6 months ago, Niele explained as Samuel curled up on a bedroll near the fire, already half asleep. White men took their horses, burned their lodge. Samuel has been living wild since then. And you, her face darkened. That is a longer story. Luke nodded, understanding. Some stories needed their own time. He gave Samuel his bed, made up the bedroll for Niele near the fire, and settled into his chair to keep watch. Outside, wind howled around the cabin walls, but inside the warmth held. For the first time in months, Luke's cabin didn't feel empty. Niele's voice came soft from the darkness. Sheriff Luke Carver. Why do you live alone? The question caught him off guard. Easier that way. Easier than what? Luke was quiet for a long time, listening to Samuel's steady breathing and the pop of burning wood. Easier than caring about people who might leave. Everyone leaves eventually. Not everyone chooses to. Another silence, this one thoughtful. Then Niele said, Samuel's mother used to say that some people are meant to be alone, but others are meant to buy the shelter when the storm comes. Luke looked across the room to where she lay, her profile outlined by firelight. Which one are you? I do not know yet, she said. Which one are you? The question followed him into sleep, and when he woke to pale dawn light filtering through the windows, he found his answer in the sight of Niele and Samuel sitting at his table, sharing breakfast and speaking quietly in Apache. His cabin, his sanctuary, no longer felt like exile. It felt like home. 3 days passed in quiet routine before the outside world intruded. Luke was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard horses approaching, the sound of shod hooves on frozen ground, distinctive and deliberate. Through the trees, he counted 6 riders moving in formation, military-bearing even in civilian clothes. His blood went cold when he recognized the man in the lead, Colonel William Hayes. Luke's old commanding officer, the man who'd made Luke's army service a living hell and finally forced him out with trumped-up charges that Luke couldn't fight without destroying other good men's careers. Luke set down the axe and walked around to the front of the cabin, positioning himself between the riders and his door. Inside, he heard Nayeli moving quietly, probably getting Samuel out of sight. "Colonel," Luke said evenly as Hayes reined in 10 feet away. "Lieutenant Carver." Hayes smiled, but it never touched his eyes. "Or should I say Sheriff Carver now? It's just Luke. Army and I parted ways 6 years ago." "So I heard. Shame, really. You were a good soldier once." Hayes's gaze moved to the cabin behind Luke. "Of course I hear you've taken up new hobbies." Luke kept his face carefully neutral. "Don't know what you mean." "No," Hayes gestured, and one of his men rode forward, carrying a wanted poster. "Apache woman named Nayeli, also goes by Morning Star, escaped federal custody 3 weeks ago, worth $500 to whoever brings her back." Luke studied the poster, crude drawing, but recognizable enough. "Haven't seen her." "Funny thing about tracks in the snow, Luke, they tell interesting stories. Yours lead right to this cabin along with those of a woman and child." The cabin door opened behind Luke and Nayeli stepped out. She wore one of Luke's spare shirts over her patched dress, her hair braided back, chin held high despite the fear Luke could see in her eyes. "I am here," she said simply. Hayes's smile widened. "Miss Morning Star, you've led us quite a chase." "My name is Nayeli." "Your name is whatever I say it is, girl. You're federal property now." Hayes gestured to his men. "Arrest her." Luke's hand dropped to his Colt. "She's under my protection." The words surprised him as much as they did Hayes. He hadn't planned to say them, but they felt true the moment they left his mouth. "Your protection," Hayes laughed. "On what authority?" Luke's mind raced. Federal marshal trumped local sheriff, and they both knew it. But there was one law even federal authority had to respect. "As her husband," Luke said. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Nellie's eyes widened, but she didn't contradict him. Hayes's expression darkened. "You married an Apache, a federal prisoner. Married a woman who was never properly convicted of anything," Luke said. "Territorial law recognizes common law marriage after cohabitation. She's been living here as my wife." It was a thin protection, and Hayes knew it, but it would require paperwork hearings proof. Time Luke hoped to use to figure out what was really going on. Hayes studied them both for a long moment. "Interesting. We'll be back, Luke, with proper documentation. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The riders departed, leaving tracks in the snow that looked like a warning. Luke turned to find Nayeli watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "Husband," she said carefully, "it was the only legal protection I could think of. And you did not ask me first." Luke's stomach sank. "I'm sorry. I should have." "You should have," she agreed, "but it was the right choice." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by the weight of what he'd just committed to. Marriage, even fake marriage, was serious business, especially when it came with federal complications. "What did you do?" he asked. "Really?" Nayeli was quiet for a moment, then gestured toward the cabin. "Samuel should hear this too." Inside, she sat cross-legged on the floor while Samuel curled up beside her. Luke took his chair, suddenly feeling like the outsider in his own home. "I am daughter of Chief Running Bear of the Mountain Apache," Nayeli began. "6 months ago, soldiers came to our camp, said they were looking for stolen horses. They found horses that had been given to us by Hayes for safe passage through our lands." Luke's jaw tightened. "Set up. Hayes accused us of theft, said we would be punished unless the chief surrendered his daughter as insurance of good behavior." Her voice stayed steady, but Luke saw her hands clench. "My father refused, so Hayes took me by force." "Where were you held?" "Fort Davidson, in the colonel's private quarters." The way she said it told Luke everything he needed to know about what had happened there. Rage built in Luke's chest, hot and clean. He'd suspected Hayes was corrupt, but this was beyond corruption. This was evil. "I escaped 3 weeks ago during a supply run. Hayes had planned to sell me to a Mexican ranch owner. I heard them talking." "And you've been running since then?" Nayeli nodded. "Until the snow stopped me, until you found me." Luke was quiet for a long time, processing the implications. Hayes wasn't just corrupt, he was running a human trafficking operation, probably involving other Apache women, using his federal authority as cover. "We can't let him take you back," Luke said finally. You're under my protection now. That's not just words." Luke met her eyes. "But Hayes will be back with paperwork that makes our marriage legal or proves it isn't. We need to make it real." "Real marriage?" Nieli said slowly. "Real marriage. Legal documents, witnesses if we can find them. Make it stick so tight that even federal authority can't break it easily." Samuel spoke up suddenly in Apache, rapid and urgent. Nieli answered him, her voice gentling. Then she looked back at Luke. "Samuel says you are a good man, but this will bring danger to you. He asked if you understand this." Luke studied the boy's thin face, old eyes, hands that trembled slightly from months of fear and hunger. Then he looked at Aniele, proud and beautiful and damaged in ways that made his chest ache. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I understand." Nellie smiled, then the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face completely, making her look young and alive instead of hunted. "Then we have much work to do, husband." The fall spring that followed Hayes's visit gave them 6 days of warmth that felt like a gift. Luke rode into Clearwater twice, once to file marriage papers with the territorial office, and once to stock up on supplies he hoped they wouldn't need for a siege. The town's reaction was about what he'd expected. Raised eyebrows, whispered conversations that stopped when he walked by, cold stares from the church ladies. But no one challenged him directly. Luke Carver had kept their town safe for 6 years, and that earned him some benefit of doubt even if they didn't like his choices. Mrs. Chen at the general store was different. The elderly Chinese woman had faced her own share of prejudice and understood survival better than most. "You need medicine," she said quietly while measuring out flour. "Herbs for healing, fever break tea. Also this." She slipped a small derringer into the bag. "For your wife. Small hands need small gun." Luke nodded his thanks, touched by the unexpected kindness. Back at the cabin, he found Nieli teaching Samuel to read from Luke's one book, a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress his mother had left behind. The domestic scene stopped him cold in the doorway, longing hitting him like a physical blow. This was what he'd never let himself want. Family, belonging, the sound of voices in his home that meant safety instead of silence. "Any trouble in town?" Nieli asked, not looking up from the book. "Some looks, no words." Luke set down the supplies. "How's his reading coming?" Samuel learns quickly. He speaks 3 languages already, Apache, Spanish, and English. Reading is just another pattern to master. Pride colored her voice when she talked about the boy, the same tone Luke remembered his own mother using. Samuel had found a protector in Nieli, and she'd found a purpose that went beyond survival. That evening, after Samuel had fallen asleep, Luke and Nieli sat by the fire drinking coffee and planning for Hayes's return. "He will bring more men this time," Nieli said, "and legal papers that seem official." "Seem official?" "Hayes is good at making wrong things look right on paper. That is how he has survived so long." Her voice carried bitter knowledge. "But there are others who know what he does. Other women taken, other families destroyed." Luke set down his cup. "What others?" 3 Apache women from different tribes. 1 Navajo girl very young. 2 Mexican women from across the border. Nieli stared into the flames. "Hayes has buyers who prefer exotic goods." The rage that had been building in Luke's chest for days crystallized into something hard and cold. "Where are they?" "I do not know. When I escaped, they were gone, sold or dead." She looked at him directly. "This is why I cannot go back. Not because I fear death, but because I fear what comes before it." Luke reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. Her fingers were strong, calloused from work, real as everything else about her. "You're not going back," he said simply. She studied their joined hands. "This marriage, it is protection only." The question hung between them, honest and complicated. Luke thought about the way his chest tightened when she smiled, the way her presence had filled the empty spaces in his life he'd gotten used to ignoring. "Started that way," he said carefully. But, but, but I'm not pretending anymore." Nieli was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "In my tribe, marriage is not just words spoken. It is choice made new each day. Choice to stand with someone when all the world stands against you. Luke understood what she was offering, not just legal protection, but partnership. Real partnership with all the risks and rewards that came with it. I choose you, he said, both of you. That night, for the first time, Nellie shared his bed, not out of necessity, but by choice. She curled against his side, her head on his chest, and Luke lay awake listening to her breathe and wondering how he'd gotten so lucky. Morning brought the sound of many horses and the end of their borrowed time. Through the window, Luke counted 12 riders approaching in formation. Hayes rode at the front along with a man in an expensive suit who could only be federal authority. Behind them came 10 soldiers in full uniform, rifles ready. Take Samuel and go out the back, Luke told Nayeli as he checked his weapons. There's a root cellar behind the woodpile. Stay there until... No. Neely's voice was calm but final. We face this together. She strapped on the derringer Mrs. Chen had given her, then positioned herself beside the front window where she could see outside. Samuel crouched near the fireplace, his young face set with determination that broke Luke's heart. Hayes dismounted 20 feet from the cabin, just out of easy pistol range. The man in the suit stayed on his horse, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Luke Carver, Hayes called. By order of Federal Marshal Davidson, you are to surrender the fugitive known as Morning Star for immediate transport to federal custody. Luke opened the door, but stayed in the doorway, his hand resting on his Colt. My wife isn't going anywhere. The marshal spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Mr. Carver, if you have indeed married this woman, that marriage was illegal. She was federal property at the time. She was an unconvicted prisoner being held without trial. Luke shot back. Territorial law supersedes federal authority in matters of marriage between consenting adults. It was legal nonsense, and they all knew it, but it sounded official enough to give the marshal pause. Hayes wasn't interested in legal niceties. Enough of this. Davidson, we have our orders. Take the woman. The marshal looked uncomfortable. Colonel, if there are prior questions about the legality, there are no questions. Hayes drew his sidearm. Luke, send her out or we come in. Luke stepped fully outside, his Colt clearing leather in one smooth motion. You want her, you go through me. The tableau held for a heartbeat, Luke facing 12 armed men with nothing but stubborn principle and a six-shooter. Then Nayeli appeared in the doorway behind him. Colonel Hayes, she said clearly, you forget that I know about your other businesses. I know about the women you have sold. I know about the Mexican gold you have stolen. I know about the Apache children you have taken. Hayes's face went white, then red with rage. You know nothing, you lying savage. I know enough. Nayeli stepped forward until she stood beside Luke. And I have written it down. All of it, with dates and names. Luke glanced at her surprised. She met his eyes briefly and he saw the truth there. She was bluffing, but it was a good bluff. Where, Hayes demanded, safe place. Place you will never find. If something happens to me, my husband, or Samuel, that information goes to the territorial governor and the Army command in Denver. The marshal was looking decidedly nervous now. Colonel, if there are other charges... There are no other charges, Hayes snapped. She's lying to save herself. Maybe, Nayeli said calmly, but are you willing to risk your career to find out? The standoff stretched taut as wire. Hayes's men looked between their colonel and the marshal, uncertain who held real authority. Luke felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Then Samuel appeared in the doorway. The boy stepped out between Luke and Nayeli, small and thin, but standing straight. He spoke in clear English, his young voice carrying across the yard. This is my family now. You will not take them. Something shifted in the atmosphere. Even hardened soldiers could see what they were being asked to do, tear apart a family to satisfy one man's vendetta. Luke felt rather than saw some of the rifles lower slightly. Hayes saw it too. His face twisted with fury as he raised his weapon toward Samuel. You little half-breed bastard, Luke's Colt spoke first. The bullet took Hayes in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow. The soldiers raised their weapons, but the marshal's voice cut through the chaos. Hold fire! Stand down! Hayes struggled to his feet, blood spreading across his shirt. Davidson, arrest them all. The marshal studied the scene, a wounded colonel threatening children, a local sheriff protecting his family soldiers, who clearly didn't want to fight. Whatever calculation he ran came down on the side of discretion. Colonel Hayes, you're bleeding. We need to get you medical attention. This matter can be reviewed through proper channels. Davidson, I am ordering you. Sir, you are wounded and not thinking clearly. We're returning to base. It wasn't exactly a victory, but it was reprieve. The soldiers helped Hayes onto his horse, his threats and curses growing fainter as they rode away. Luke kept his weapon drawn until they disappeared into the trees. Is it over? Samuel asked quietly. Luke holstered his Colt and pulled the boy against his side. No, son, but we bought ourselves time. Nellie pressed close to his other side, her hand finding his. What do we do now? Luke looked at his family, his wife, his son, in all but blood, and made his choice. Now we make it real, he said. All of it. The Apache riders appeared at dawn 3 days later. 6 warriors mounted on painted horses, their presence announced only by Luke's horse, whinnying nervously in the barn. Luke stepped onto his porch to find them arranged in a perfect line 50 yards from the cabin, waiting with the patience of stones. Niele emerged beside him, her breath catching when she saw them. She spoke rapidly in Apache, then translated for Luke. My father has come. The man in the center rode forward alone, tall, weathered with silver-streaked hair, braided with feathers and beads. He stopped 10 feet from the porch and studied Luke with dark eyes that missed nothing. When he spoke, his English was precise despite the accent. You are the one who married my daughter. Yes, sir. Luke felt like he was being measured for burial clothes. She tells me you have treated her with respect, that you protect the boy Samuel as your own son. Luke nodded. Yes, sir. Chief Running Bear was quiet for a long moment. The Blue Coat Colonel has sent messages to the Army post. He claims you are criminals, that my daughter is his property. He promises gold for our help in taking her. Luke's hand moved instinctively toward his Colt, but the chief's slight headshake stopped him. I did not come to collect bounties, Sheriff Carver. I came to judge the man who would be my daughter's husband. For the next hour, Luke underwent the most thorough interrogation of his life. Running Bear asked about his past, his intentions, his ability to protect Niele and Samuel. The questions were fair but relentless, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected many lives. Finally, the chief turned to Nellie and spoke in rapid Apache. She responded at length, her voice earnest. Luke caught Samuel's name several times along with words that sounded like affection and respect. When the conversation ended, Running Bear studied Luke again. My daughter says you have a good heart, but a fool's courage. She says you would die before letting harm come to her or the boy. Yes, sir. She also says you are alone too much, that you carry old wounds that make you afraid to trust. The chief's expression softened slightly. This I understand. War leaves marks on all men's spirits. Luke felt heat rise in his face. Niele had seen deeper into him than he'd realized. What matters, Running Bear continued, is that she chooses you freely and you choose her the same way. In Apache tradition, marriage is not ownership. It is partnership between equals. That's what I want, Luke said. Partnership. Running Bear nodded slowly. Then you have my blessing, son, but also my warning: the colonel will not give up. He has too much at stake. What kind of stake? The chief's expression darkened. Gold stolen from Mexican traders. Apache children sold to brothels in California. Women taken for rich men's pleasure houses. Hayes has built an empire of suffering, and my daughter threatens all of it. Luke felt sick. How many people know? Too few with power to act. Too many with reasons to stay silent. Running Bear's voice carried bitter experience. But you have given us something: new legal protection under white man's law. If Nellie is truly your wife, even federal authority cannot simply take her. That afternoon, Running Bear performed a traditional Apache marriage ceremony in Luke's front yard. It was nothing like the Christian weddings Luke had attended. No preacher, no formal voice, just the joining of two lives witnessed by family and blessed by ancient words. Niele wore her patched dress with the addition of a beaded headband her father had brought. Luke wore his best shirt and Sunday pants, feeling underdressed but honored to be included in something so sacred to her people. When it was done, Running Bear placed his hands on Luke's shoulders. You are Apache now as well as white. This brings privileges and responsibilities. My people will shelter you if needed, but you must also shelter them. Luke understood what he was accepting, not just marriage to Nellie, but adoption into a tribe, a culture, a family much larger than his small cabin. It should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. That evening, after the warriors had departed, Luke sat with his wife and son around their fire and tried to plan for an uncertain future. Hayes will come again, Neely said, with more men, better legal papers. He cannot afford to let this go. Then we make sure he can't afford to keep it up, Luke said. You mentioned information about his operations. How much do you actually know? Neely was quiet for a moment. More than I told him. Names, dates, places. I was in his quarters for 2 months before I escaped. I heard many conversations he thought I did not understand. Enough to bring him down. Maybe, but who would believe the word of an Apache woman against a federal colonel? Luke smiled grimly. Leave that to me. The next morning, Luke rode into Clearwater and sent 3 telegrams, one to the territorial governor, one to the Army command in Denver, and one to a newspaper editor in Colorado Springs who owed him a favor from his Army days. Each message contained the same basic information: allegations of corruption against Colonel Hayes, requests for investigation, witness protection for informants. He signed them with his full name and official title, making himself a target, but also making the situation too public to simply disappear. By evening, returned telegrams were arriving. The governor's office promised investigation. Army command requested detailed reports. The newspaper editor smelled a story and was sending a reporter. It started, Luke told Neely as they prepared for bed. No going back now. She curled against him, her head on his chest. Are you afraid? Luke considered the question honestly. Terrified, but not of dying, of failing, of not being able to protect you and Samuel. You will not fail, she said with the quiet confidence. Apache women know strength when we see it. You have the strength to see this through. Her faith humbled him. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a lonely sheriff going through the motions of a life. Now he was a husband, a father, and a man with purpose beyond mere survival. The reporter arrived 2 days later, a young man named Morrison with ink-stained fingers and the hungry look of someone who sensed a career-making story. Luke spent 3 hours giving him background, while Nayeli provided details that made Morrison's eyes widen and his pencil move faster. This is bigger than corruption, Morrison said when they finished. This is a criminal enterprise using federal authority as cover. If even half of what you're telling me is true, Hayes should be in prison. Proving it is the trick, Luke said. Maybe not as hard as you think. I've been investigating rumors about missing Apache women for months. Your wife's testimony gives me the breakthrough I needed. That night, Luke lay awake planning for every contingency he could imagine. Legal victory, Pyrrhic victory, complete defeat. He wanted to be ready for all of them. Beside him, Neely slept peacefully, one hand resting on his chest. On the floor nearby, Samuel breathed with the deep rhythm of childhood, safe and trusting. Whatever came next, Luke would face it as what he'd never allowed himself to be before a man with everything to lose and everything to fight for. The attack came just before dawn on a Tuesday that started peaceful and turned deadly in the span of a heartbeat. Luke woke to his horse screaming in the barn, not the whinny of fear, but the shriek of pain. He was on his feet with his Colt in hand before his mind fully processed what he had heard. Stay down, he whispered to Nellie as he moved to the window. Smoke was rising from the barn. Through the gray light, he could see figures moving in the trees, too many to count, positioned in a loose circle around the cabin. Fire, Samuel whispered from his bedroll. They're burning us out. Luke's mind raced. Smoke would flush them outside where rifles waited, but staying inside meant burning alive. Root cellar, he decided. There's a tunnel that comes up behind the woodpile. We can... The front door exploded inward, splintered by an axe. 3 men burst through, not soldiers this time, but hired guns with hard faces and easy violence in their movements. Luke's first shot took the leader, center mass, dropping him across the threshold. His second shot went wide as he dove to avoid return fire that splintered wood where his head had been. Nayeli was moving the small derringer in her hand, barking twice. One of the attackers stumbled, blood spreading across his shirt. Samuel had vanished, smart boy, finding whatever cover he could. The cabin filled with gun smoke and chaos. Luke rolled behind his overturned table, reloading by feel while bullets chewed chunks from the wood above his head. Carver, Hayes's voice came from outside. Send out the woman and the phone and you can live. Luke answered with a bullet that shattered the window frame where Hayes's head had been visible. The attack came from three sides at once: front door, back window, side wall, where someone was chopping through the logs with an axe. Luke moved between positions, his Colt speaking steadily, trying to cover too much ground with too few bullets. Then Niele was beside him, reloading his weapon while he fired the spare. Her hands were steady, her face calm despite the chaos. Samuel, Luke asked during a lull in the firing. Cellar? Safe. She pressed the loaded gun into his hands. More coming through the back. Luke spun and put two bullets through the window where a rifle barrel was appearing. The weapon fell, followed by cursing and the sound of someone hitting the ground hard. But they were running out of ammunition, and Hayes had more men than Luke had bullets. The smoke from the burning barn was getting thicker, and he could smell something else burning the cabin's roof. We need to move, he said. Nellie nodded toward the trap door that led to the root cellar. Samuel knows the way to the tunnel, but they will be watching the exit. Then we make a different exit. Luke had built the cabin himself, knew every board and beam. The back wall shared a foundation with the old chicken coop, a structure so dilapidated that no one would think to watch it. Can you get to Samuel? Niele was already moving, sliding across the floor to the trap door. Luke provided covering fire as she disappeared below, then followed when his last bullet was gone. The cellar was dark and cramped, filled with the smell of earth and stored potatoes. Samuel crouched in the corner, pale but unhurt. This way, Luke whispered, leading them to the far wall where a narrow passage led under the chicken coop's foundation. They crawled through dirt and debris, emerged into morning light behind a screen of tall weeds. The abandoned coop stood between them and the cabin, smoke obscuring their movements. Luke counted muzzle flashes, at least 8 guns still active. Too many for a straight fight, but maybe enough for something sneaky. Stay here, he told Niele and Samuel. When the shooting stops, run for the trees and don't look back. Luke, I'm not dying today, he said firmly, but I'm damn sure not running either. He circled wide through the smoke, coming up behind the attackers from the direction they least expected. The first man never saw him coming. Luke's knife slid between his ribs, quiet as a whisper. The second man turned at his partner's gurgle, but Luke's Colt spoke first. The third man broke and ran when he saw 2 of his friends down and Luke Carver coming for him with death in his eyes. The tide was turning, but Hayes still had men positioned around the cabin. Luke needed to end this before luck ran out. He found Hayes crouched behind a fallen log, directing his remaining men with hand signals. The colonel's shoulder was bandaged, where Luke's bullet had found him days before, but his gun hand was steady. Luke stepped out of the smoke like a ghost from hell. Just you and me now, Colonel. Hayes spun his weapon, rising. Both guns fired at the same moment, the reports echoing across the mountains like thunder. Hayes's bullet took bark from the tree beside Luke's head. Luke's bullet took Hayes' center mass, the impact lifting him off his feet and dropping him beside the log like a broken doll. The shooting stopped. Smoke drifted across the clearing where Luke's cabin was beginning to burn in earnest. Of Hayes's men, 3 were dead, 2 wounded, and the rest had vanished into the wilderness. Luke knelt beside the colonel, checking his wound. Hayes was still breathing, but barely. Should have left it alone, Hayes whispered, blood flecking his lips. Should have, Luke agreed. Too late now. Hayes tried to say something else, but the words turned to blood and then to silence. Luke stood slowly, his hands shaking with aftermath. Behind him, he heard Niele and Samuel emerging from their hiding place. Is it over? Samuel asked. Luke looked at his burning cabin, at the dead men scattered around his yard, at the woman and boy who had become his family. Everything he'd built was gone, but everything that mattered was safe. Yeah, son, he said, pulling them both close. It's over. The new cabin went up on the same spot where the old one had burned, but bigger this time. 3 bedrooms instead of 1, a proper kitchen, windows that let in morning light and evening peace. Luke built it with help from Running Bear's warriors and a few town folks who had decided that a man who'd faced down federal corruption deserved their respect. Mrs. Chen provided supplies at cost, and Morrison's newspaper articles had made Luke something of a local hero. The official investigation into Hayes' operation took 6 months and resulted in 12 arrests, including 2 federal marshals and a territorial judge. 3 of the missing women were found alive in California and returned to their families. Hayes' stolen gold was recovered and distributed to the victims' families. Luke resigned his sheriff's badge and took a job as territorial marshal work that let him stay close to home while still serving justice. Naeli opened a school for Apache and white children, both teaching them to read in 3 languages. Samuel grew tall and strong, learning to be both Apache and white, both son and bridge between worlds. He called Luke Pa and Naeli mother, and Luke never tired of hearing either word. On their first wedding anniversary, Luke and Naeli stood in front of their new cabin and watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. Samuel was inside practicing his letters, his voice carrying through the windows as he read aloud. "Any regrets?" Luke asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Naeli leaned against him, solid and warm and real. "Only that it took so long to find you." Luke smiled, thinking about the lonely man he'd been a year ago. That man had ridden past suffering because involvement meant pain. But involvement also meant joy, family purpose beyond mere survival. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For trusting a stranger in the snow, for seeing something in me worth saving." Nellie turned in his arms, her dark eyes bright with love and laughter. "Sheriff Luke Carver, you did the saving. All of us." As night settled over their sanctuary, their home, their family, their love, Luke knew she was wrong. They had saved each other the way broken people do when they choose to stop running and start building something better from the pieces of what they've lost. In the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs to the mountain stars. But inside the cabin, all was warmth and light and the sound of voices belonging to each other. Some things Luke had learned were worth fighting for. Some sanctuaries were worth any price to defend. And sometimes when a man opened his heart to strangers in the snow, he found that he'd been searching for home his whole life, and home had been searching for him too. Thank you for joining Luke, Naeli, and Samuel on their incredible journey from strangers to family. Sometimes the most powerful bonds are forged in the hardest moments, and true sanctuary isn't a place, it's the people who stand with you when everything else falls apart. Which moment touched you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming Western romance stories. Until next time, remember that every soul deserves a place to call home.